If you have been unfortunate enough to be subjected to the mainstream puppet show, where some actors argue for the use of torture, or their doublespeak equivalent, enhanced interrogation, as a way of extracting information from prisoners, whereas other opposing puppets flatly deny the efficiency of this type of activity, then you may very well be confused. Confusion is the objective of this stage show. In this debate, where a known reality is pitted against a propped-up straw man, a type of fear-based mind control is wielded over you. The more fear that they can generate in your heart, the more power they have over you.
Well, what would you do? I said, I'd prove it immediately, but I'd make it also much worse. They said, what do you mean? I said, I'd do much worse. I said, they're chopping off our heads in the Middle East. They want to kill us. They want to kill us. They want to kill our country. They want to knock out our cities. And don't tell me it doesn't work. Torture works, okay, folks? Torture, I have these guys. Torture doesn't work. Believe me, it works, okay? And waterboarding is your minor form. Some people say it's not actually torture. Let's assume it is. But they asked me the question, what do you think of waterboarding? Absolutely fine. But we should go much stronger than waterboarding. That's the way I feel.
Fear is their weapon of choice, and you are the enemy. Psychopaths need to torture, and that will become apparent as you watch the information unfold in this presentation. These same psychopaths want to warp your mind through sufficient fear that you will become a parapsychopath, allowing them to do anything they want to do if they tell you it's necessary to keep you safe. This charade has nothing to do with safety. It's all about injecting fear-based mind control into the population so that it, meaning you, can be easily manipulated and tricked into doing things that are immoral and not in your best interest. Like, for example, launching wars, censoring speech, giving up your privacy, and, of course, allowing the inhumane treatment of innocent people throughout the world. In that way, the subject of torture is useful to the controllers, but as a method of extracting information, it is one of the least effective methods known to man, and has a much greater potential of eliciting false information than finding truth. Actually, it's been known for at least 400 years that torture does not work for obtaining useful information. From an article by Rick Schreierer in the Scientific American,
he recounts a story told by author and journalist Daniel P. Mannix. According to this story, during the European witch craze, the Duke of Brunswick in Germany invited 2 Jesuit scholars to oversee the Inquisition's use of torture to extract information from accused witches. The inquisitors are doing their duty. They are arresting only people who have been implicated by the confession of other witches, the Jesuits reported. The Duke was skeptical. Suspecting that people will say anything to stop the pain, he invited the Jesuits to join him at the local dungeon to witness a woman being stretched on a rack. "Now, woman, you are a confessed witch," he began, pointing at the Jesuits. "I suspect these 2 men of being warlocks. What do you say? Another turn of the rack, executioners." The Jesuits could not believe what they heard next. "No, no," the woman groaned. "You are quite right. I have often seen them at the Sabbat. They can turn themselves into goats, wolves, and other animals. Several witches have had children by them. One woman even had 8 children whom these men fathered. The children had heads like toads and legs like spiders." Turning to the flabbergasted Jesuits, the Duke inquired, "Shall I put you to the torture until you confess?" One of these Jesuits was Friedrich Spee, who responded to this poignant experiment on the psychology of torture by publishing a book in 1631 entitled Cautio Criminalis, which played a role in bringing about the end of the witch mania and demonstrating why torture as a tool to obtain useful information doesn't work. This is why, in addition to its inhumane elements, it is banned in all Western nations, including the U.S., whose 8th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishments.
in most torture scenarios, even if the torturing psychopath knows that he definitely has the very suspect who has accurate information, and knows for sure that by applying just the right amount of pain, he will extort the correct intelligence, it still doesn't work. It's a Hollywood fantasy. In reality, the person in captivity may or may not be the correct person. He may or may not have accurate information and may or may not be able to cough up useful intelligence, particularly if his or her motivation is to terminate the torture. In contrast, a 2014 study in the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology entitled The Who, What, and Why of Human Intelligence Gathering surveyed 152 interrogators and found that rapport and relationship building techniques were employed most often and perceived as the most effective, regardless of context and intended outcome, particularly in comparison to confrontational techniques. Another 2014 study in the same journal, interviewing high-value detainees, sampled 64 practitioners and detainees and found that detainees were more likely to disclose meaningful information and earlier in the interview when rapport-building techniques were used. Finally, an exhaustive 2014 report by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence analyzed millions of internal CIA documents related to the torture of terrorism suspects, concluding that, quote, the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees, end quote. It added that, quote, multiple CIA detainees fabricated information, resulting in faulty intelligence. And besides all these studies, one must remember that it's not the Middle Ages. Today, there are electronic techniques and drugs that can loosen the tongue of the captive and make information gathering easier and more fruitful. Like, for example, oxytocin. According to scientists at Emory University outside of Atlanta, quote, the effects we're seeing from oxytocin today are really just the tip of the iceberg. Instead of using interrogation techniques that threaten to harm detainees and have been repeatedly proven to be ineffective, interrogators could play good cop with the detainees. With the added edge of oxytocin, they could tip the balances a little. You may not be getting a truth serum, but you're getting them to trust you. And then there are technology often called synthetic telepathy and brain reading technology that are either able to read your thoughts right now or are just on the verge of being able to do that. We can't tell because, of course, it's classified. But according to a recent article in Mind Power World, quote, mind reading technology is here to stay and is getting ready to break into the commercial world in a major way, while other mind influencing technologies are classified for national security purposes. But laughing in the faces of such information, there are hundreds of black torture sites located around the world, set up supposedly to gain intelligence from the enemy, whoever they might be, the most visible of which is Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This facility is a public disgrace and an embarrassment to all Americans in particular and Westerners in general. Why is it there? What is it for? Here's a story from a resident who was held captive for many years at this atrocity by the sea. His name is Mohamedou Ould Shlahi. He is now 44 and existed at Guantanamo Bay since 2002. He's never been charged with a crime or received a trial. Reading from his diary. During the abuse, Shlahi said he prayed out loud, inducing anger and eventual punitive repercussions from his guards. Quote, "Stop praying, Mother Blanker. You're killing people," one guard said, and punched me hard in the mouth, end quote, he recalled. His entries gradually became more violent when he details beatings that left him bloody, swollen, and choking for air. Quote, "They tightened the chains around my ankles and my wrists. Afterwards, I started to bleed," end quote. He described one instance in which he was physically beaten and threatened with the release of a chomping dog. Quote, "The beating party would go on for the next 3 or 4 hours before they turned me over to another team that was going to use different torture techniques," end quote, he wrote. Despite the hours of interrogation, which he described as, quote, 24 hours a day, 3 and sometimes 4 shifts a day, Schlahe claims he never provided any information that was truthful. He just told them what they wanted to hear. Many have tried to escape this dungeon of evil by trying to starve themselves to death. But the psychopaths in charge would not let them escape, even through death. Guards were commanded to force feed those refraining to eat. This was done through hard plastic feeding tubes inserted through their noses. This process was so excruciatingly painful that starvation to death was not even an option. Here are some statistics you may not be aware of concerning this psychopath's wet dream called Guantanamo Bay. Did you know that only 5% of the victims at Guantanamo Bay were picked up by U.S. forces in the Middle East, whereas 86% were turned over to the coalition forces in response to a bounty offer? The amount offered for turning over a person to the coalition was, quote, millions of dollars, enough to take care of your family, your village, your tribe for the rest of your life, end quote. Now I ask you, would this criteria have the effect of turning over high-value information-laden terrorists, or simply people that were disliked or deemed expendable to the community? No, I would say that many, if not most, imprisoned at Guantanamo were not even terrorists. They were simply people that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, taken away from their homes and families to be perpetually tortured for years on end without a charge, trial, or chance to escape, even through death. Let me remind you that supposedly these victims were tortured to gain critical, fresh information. This went on for sometimes over 10 years. Seriously, just reflect on that for a minute and let the utter absurdity sink in. So my question to you is, was the incredible monetary expense levied from the American taxpayer and the myriad of outrageous violations of moral law and human ethics perpetrated against these men critical for information extraction? No. This torture is not for the extraction of information, nor for defense. It was done for a much, much more nefarious reason that we'll discuss later in this presentation. There is another reason, in fact, several other reasons torture, this debasement of humanity, is practiced. The activity of torture is important to controllers for several purposes, other than the ruse of pretending to be working to extract life-saving information. There is hardly anything life-saving about torture. There are purposes for which this type of brutality is ideally and uniquely suited. None of them, I might add, are beneficial to humanity in any way. Here are several effective uses of torture that we will explore during the duration of this video.
Number 1. Torture is excellent for the fabrication of false confessions, for the creation of false and deceptive narratives, which provide supposed evidence used to substantiate false narratives used in various types of deception scenarios. Number 2. Torture is especially useful for the extraction of low vibrational energies, necessary for the satanic elites to appease the demands of the Luciferian interdimensional entities that they feel give them their power. Torture, wars, starvation, disease, and other horrors are also useful for this purpose. Number 3. Most torture going on all over the world today we will refer to as transformational torture. It is used to wage war against humanity and is aimed at the ultimate destruction of the human race as we know it. Most of these efforts of the psychopaths can fit under the rubrics of A. Beta tests to find various breaking points of the human species, B. Mind control and behavior control, and C. Torture normalization. Just like pedophilia, this deviance must be made commonplace and acceptable in order to allow in the New World Order, also known as the beast system, and facilitate the transhumanist or post-human agenda to be superimposed throughout the world. Technological advances facilitate their envisioned panopticon reality where everyone is constantly monitored and deviations are controlled through torture.
This purpose is often confused with the extracting of information, but in reality they are two very different things. One implies the uncovering of information, and the other asks for admission or assigned testimony supporting a preset narrative, always to be used for deception of some sort. For example, according to Anthony Sutton, author of Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, immediately following World War II, the Rockefellers commissioned, at the cost of $137,000, the drafting of a document basically setting out the definitive history of World War II. This was to consolidate the narrative that would guide the globalist propaganda regarding this worldwide atrocity throughout the duration of the 20th century and up to the current time. This false narrative, or false history, was at least partially constructed through fabrications devoid of any connection with reality and signed confession statements obtained through extremely brutal torture. Now, if you've done some research, you know that all the elements or sides of this World War II, as well as World War I, were financed by the same international financiers. These particular psychopaths were referred to at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century as snakes in suits. The supposed allies, the Nazi regime, the Eastern Bloc, and less transparently the Chinese and Japanese factions, were puppeted by the same masters for financial gain, desired geopolitical change, and of course, population reduction. These sides were pitted against one another by the ruling elites that are still with us. All factions were controlled and maneuvered by these financial entities for blood money, the destruction of Germany, Japan, the massive depopulation of Russia, the creation of the Rothschilds' Israel, and the transferring of the Nazi mind control technology to the Anglican Vatican globalists that wield this power over us to this day. To support the narrative of the good war, torture was used to secure confessions and substantiate the innocence and saintly motives of the Anglo-American Empire. In an article entitled Tortured Confessions, Santiago Alvarez explains how torture was used to create a history that supports a narrative. He writes,
"It is finally coming to light. The Allies used extremely brutal torture against their German prisoners, not just during the war, but afterward, to force them to provide fraudulent confessions to crimes they never committed, all to get convictions at war crime trials. The subject is well known to revisionists, but the facts have been suppressed by the mainstream for more than 65 years, and few people outside of this circle are aware of it. Research proves that the British, and in extension probably also the other Allied nations, used all means at their disposal to extract any kind of incriminating evidence they deemed necessary in order to successfully indict and sentence members of the German armed forces or German officials. Coercion and torture were not an exception, but the rule. They were applied systematically to this end, and not just in isolated cases, as mainstream historians have claimed so far. In this regard, the Allied post-war methods were essentially identical to the methods applied during interrogations of the witch-hunting Holy Inquisition of the 14th to 18th century.
Recently, the same torture technique was used to get the United States and its coalition of the coerced to invade Iraq. Here's an interview with a former CIA operative, Ray McGovern, commenting to RT on how torture was used to support a deceptive narrative.
Well, the instructions were to get people to confess. Confess to what? Confess to the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Confess to the existence of operational ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. It was all a crock. They had to make this stuff up, and you can't get reliable information from torture, but you know what? Torture works beautifully if you want unreliable information. And so they conjured up not only ties, not only weapons of mass destruction, but ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And when we invaded that is the UK and the US invaded Iraq, 69% of the people in the United States believed that there were operational ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, and that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. It was a masterful propaganda performance on the part of the United States and on the part of the UK. Now, how did they do that? Well, one of the ways was they tortured this one prisoner, Al-Libi, sent him to Egypt, where, guess what? He confessed that he sent people from Al-Qaeda up to Saddam Hussein's Iraq to receive instruction in explosives.
Well, Ray, it's all rather murky. Certainly there have been some people in the past that have said that invading Iraq for 9/11 is like invading Mexico for the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
If you're among those like myself that believes that truth is important in learning lessons from history, you can easily see why this use of torture is not only a blight on human consciousness, but also blocks us from learning real lessons from the past. It's long been in the public domain, to those with eyes to see and ears to hear, that the world governments and major corporations are run by a cult of psychopathic pedo-Satanists who make no bones about admitting that they gain their power and energy by performing rituals to entities beyond this dimension. The most obvious manifestation of this reality is the cremation of care ceremonies that are performed at Bohemian Grove every summer by the rich and powerful. This is an ancient Babylonian ceremony in honor of their deity Moloch, which is another name for the beast with 1,000 names, known as Baal, Apollo, or Lucifer. This ceremony is said to guarantee wealth and power to those that perform it. It's not necessary that you believe in the Dark Lords or even in a god. The important thing to consider is that the elites do. They do rituals, pay homage, and deliver sacrifices, often human, to these entities, real or imagined. This is the root activities of the Pedogate scandals, Hollywood's public satanic rituals performed live on TV, and the basis for the practice of spirit cooking, made famous by Marina Abramovich and John Podesta. Torture plays a major role in delivering these low-level vibrations to their supposed gods. David Icke exposes this dark world and how these ruling psychopathic elites create these energies manifested through torture and death and allow them to be harvested by entities beyond this reality.
Well, that's something I've been researching and uncovering for a very, very long time, way back into the 1990s, when I started to see that there was beyond the ratio of the rest of the population, there was a prevalence, a concentrated ratio of Satanists and pedophiles in the so-called upper echelons of society, i.e. positions of power. So when you realize that, then the next question is why? Because there has to be a reason. And this takes us into very deep areas because ultimately this reality is controlled from beyond the reality that we can see. I mean, what the frequency band that we can actually see, that we call the world, is so tiny it's laughable. What we live in is the equivalent of a television or radio station. There's a frequency band. You know, you get a radio and you tune it to a frequency, you get that radio station. But that's all you get. But in the same space as all those others, the station you're on are all the other stations that are not interfering with your station because they're on different frequencies, different wavelengths. And so we are living, if you like, in a radio television station frequency band, which is interpenetrated by all the other frequency bands of life existence, which do not interfere with us unless they're very close on the dial. And very, very close to this frequency band we call the human world, the human world of the scene, is another band of frequency which is occupied by entities that don't take a human form. They take many different forms. One of the dominant ones, if not the most dominant one in relation to Earth manipulation, takes a reptilian form. And these entities feed off human energy. You see, in the Matrix movie series, there was so much truth hidden as sci-fi. And one of them was the machines feeding off human energy. That's where they got the power from. All those babies being vampired of their energy by the machines to empower them. And this force feeds off human energy. And it feeds off human energy within a certain frequency band. A frequency band that relates to it. You can only absorb energy on the frequency band that you're on. Otherwise, they, like radio stations, they pass through each other and can't be absorbed. And the frequency band of this manipulative force is what I call low vibrational human emotion. It's all based around the base emotion of fear, anxiety, depression, violence, in its most extreme form, what we call psychopathic behavior, all of this. But now, here's the point. If you have so little or no empathy, you have no capacity for compassion to the point where you can torture and sacrifice a child, what limits are there in what you will do in your behavior? Pepper bombing cities full of civilians, as in the Middle East over and over again, and they're doing it now in Mosul, or they're doing it now in Raqqa, creating world wars that create mass death, destruction and suffering. That's only a problem if you have an emotional comeback, if you have an emotional consequence. If you have no emotional consequence, and these people don't, this is why they can do this to children and have no emotional comeback, then there are no limits. Compassion, empathy, is the fail-safe mechanism of human behavior. It's what stops people doing things because they can put themselves in the place of the people who are the victims of what they would potentially do. So they won't do it because the empathy stops them. You imagine no empathy. You can do anything to anyone and you have no empathy whatsoever, no emotional consequence. This is the people we're dealing with. These are the people running NATO. These are the people running the European Union. These are the people running countries. These are the people running Britain. They're certainly the people running the United States. They are machine-like. They are software-like, rather than human-like, in the sense that we perceive human. And once that penny drops, people stop judging what these people will do by what they would do. The great dismissal that I've heard over the years is when you're explaining the scale and the depth and the depravity of what goes on, they say they would never do that. No, you would never do that. Not only will they do it, they get a rush from it. It's very hard, I know, for people to appreciate this, the depth and the scale of what we call evil that's behind world events. And what is evil?
Why are the powers that be in the United States so deathly afraid of the truth about Pizzagate being revealed? Because, as you are about to see, what's really going on globally is far worse and far darker than even what's been suggested so far by Pizzagate. And it's been practiced by some of the world's elite for centuries. As we've said repeatedly, Pizzagate is just the tip of the iceberg. In February's Symbolic Picks of the Month from Vigilant Citizen, 2 extremely disturbing murals in the city of Brussels, Belgium, were showcased, literally appearing overnight, one depicting a young boy held down by a man holding a knife, and the other, even more disturbing, featured a gutted body hanging upside down, painted on the side of a high-rise residential building. And as Vigilant Citizen noted in his article, in the end, this quote-unquote art is a symptom of the toxic mind state that permeates society. However, I'd like to point out, I think there's something much more insidious going on here. Brussels is much more than just a city in Belgium. It's considered the de facto capital of the European Union, having a long history of hosting the institutions of the European Union within its European quarter. Brussels hosts the official seats of the European Council, the Council of the European Union, and European Council, as well as a seat of the European Parliament. As we have noted, it is the bureaucrats in Brussels that control the entire European Union.
People don't understand what the European Union is, they don't understand how it's governed, they don't know who are the people who are running it, but they know that they weren't chosen by the people.
And those very same bureaucrats have superseded the authority and will of the people. We find it quite alarming that these murals appeared in Brussels, given the elite's penchant for pedophilia and what more and more appears to be human sacrifice. When I first saw that mural, it reminded me of one of the most disturbing scenes I've ever seen in a movie. And here's where things get really weird. In 2007, the movie Hostel Part 2 was released. It was directed by Eli Roth, and one of the production companies credited was Lionsgate. Hostel Part 2 is the story of 3 American college students studying abroad who are lured to a Slovakian hotel only to discover the grim reality behind it. Each and one by one, the young students are lured away and soon find themselves in the bowels of a sadist nightmare where elite from around the world gather and pay huge sums of money to have their sickest, most sadistic fantasies come true, and always resulting in the murder of one of these kidnapped victims. And in one scene, one of the most graphic and disturbing sequences ever captured on film is to be found, and it depicts exactly what you see on that building in Brussels. In the death scene of Lorna, played by actress Heather Matarazzo, the young college student finds herself bound and gagged upside down over a large tiled bath. Soon, a beautiful elite woman enters, disrobes, and proceeds to slash the throat of Lorna and bathe in the blood of her victim. The film Hostel 2 is not only sick beyond belief, but there is a tie-in here between the production company of the film, Lionsgate, and child trafficking in Haiti and the Clinton Foundation. This link has been mentioned by George Webb specifically on Day 84, Part 2.
This is the old Mark Rich funnel. You're going to find Lionsgate, which is owned by Frank Giustra, is the funnel from Frank and Carlos Slim straight through to the Clinton Foundation. This is the movie funnel. And I don't know if you remember, Lionsgate did all the ones where the girls had to run for their lives. Hunger Games, that's it. And if you read Kathy O'Brien's description of when she was, told to just put a pair of tennis shoes on naked and run for her life, and then the guys ran after her and raped her, it's almost like the plot of that movie.
Could it be that the elite around the world, in many cases, are just as sick and sadistic as the woman bathing in the blood of her victim in the movie Hostel Part 2? Because it reminds me of the story of Elizabeth Bathory, labeled by Guinness World Records as the most prolific female murderer. Bathory and 4 collaborators were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young women between 1585 and 1609. The highest number of victims cited at Bathory's trial was 650. The stories of Elizabeth Bathory's serial murders and brutality are verified by the testimony of more than 300 witnesses and survivors, as well as physical evidence and the presence of horribly mutilated dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Stories which ascribe to her vampire-like tendencies, most famously the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth. Born into a privileged family of nobility, Elizabeth was showered and endowed with wealth, education, and a stellar social position. Between 1602 and 1604, after rumors of Bathory's atrocities had spread throughout the kingdom, a Lutheran minister made complaints against her, both publicly and at the court in Vienna. Finally, in 1610, King Matthias II assigned Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate. Thurzo ordered 2 notaries to collect evidence in March 1610. The notaries collected testimony from more than 300 witnesses. According to all testimony, Bathory's initial victims were the adolescent daughters of local peasants, many of whom were lured to the castle by offers of well-paid work as maidservants in the castle. Later, she is said to have begun to kill daughters of the lesser gentry, who were sent to her by their parents to learn etiquette. 2 witnesses actually saw the Countess torture and kill young servant girls. According to the testimony of the 2 defendants, Elizabeth Bathory tortured and killed her victims not only at Saget, but also at 3 of her other properties and elsewhere. In addition to the defendants, several people were named for supplying Elizabeth Bathory with young women, procured either by deception or by force. There are so many modern parallels to what we're seeing right now. Think Jimmy Savile.
Jimmy Savile, far from being a lone predator, seemingly played an active role in supplying children to a network of child abusers in London.
Supplying children to the elite. Why are the powers that be trying so hard to cover up the truth about pedophilia and child sex trafficking? And more importantly, for those of us paying attention, are the elite telling us exactly what they're doing? Ritual satanic abuse, and human sacrifice. The murder scene of the young college student in Hostel Part 2 is exactly what's depicted on the side of this building in Brussels, Belgium, and counted by the elite as art. Not only is Pizzagate just the tip of the global pedophile and satanic ritual sacrifice iceberg, what lies just below the surface is far more horrifying than most of us can imagine.
Again, this use of torture does not benefit mankind. It only benefits the egos of, and perhaps the gods of, the rich and famous. As an aside, terror and fear is also one of the major purposes for wars, starvation around the world, the cancer agenda, the financial control system, mass immigration, taxation, and other aspects of the Luciferian matrix in which we were all currently held. We are unfortunately at a time in history when technological advances hidden from the public can facilitate the satanic elite's envisioned panopticon reality, where everything, every movement, every thought, and every dream can be monitored and controlled to the benefit of the controlling psychopaths. A glimpse into this world exposes the extremes of torture being endured by innocent citizens today, and how these same torture devices will control your thoughts, your emotions, and your every movement in the very near future. There is a deep history of torture-based, government-sponsored mind control experimentation on children throughout the Western world, especially emanating from the U.S. and its infamous Project Paperclip. As described by the 1975 Church Committee report, quote, "These various CIA MKUltra programs resulted in substantial violations of the rights of individuals within the United States," end quote. This statement, bleached and politically impotent as it is the most damning utterance to come out of this committee. Its intention was to expose and stop these blatantly immoral and destructive programs being conducted on innocent civilians in the name of national security. Admittedly, however, this is understandable because the Church Committee's efforts were thwarted at every turn by the CIA, the deep state, and the executive branch of government, headed at that time by Gerald Ford, and personally stymied by his deputy chief of staff, Dick Cheney. In addition, you should know that all documents regarding these programs had been previously ordered to be destroyed in 1973 by Richard Helms, the then CIA director, and Sid Gottlieb, head of the MKUltra programs. In January, as Helms was leaving the agency, he ordered all documents pertaining to the unconscionable mind control experiments, Artichoke, Monarch, Often, Operation Midnight Crisis, all collectively referred to as MKUltra, destroyed. The outgoing CIA director and his trusted protege and psychopath, Sid Gottlieb, hoped no doubt to wipe out all traces of the abominable experiments and all history of the thousands of human victims. But in retrospect, we can get some inkling of what was going on with the CIA mind control and torture programs through a 1977 FOIA request and various lawsuits filed to gain justice for the abused victims. The FOIA request sought information on the grant proposals and contracts awarded under the MKUltra program and the names of the institutions and individuals that performed the research. The extent of the program was astounding. It was found that grants and contracts were awarded to 149 sub-projects, 80 institutions, and 185 private researchers. To give you an idea of what went on during these projects, your tax dollars at work, one lawsuit involved a medical doctor named Ewan Cameron and the Allen Memorial Institute. Without conceding liability in 1988, the CIA agreed to pay $750,000 to settle a case brought on behalf of 9 plaintiffs who were subjected to federally funded mind control experiments sponsored by the CIA and conducted by prominent psychiatrist Ewan Cameron, MD. The experiments included heavy doses of LSD, electroshock, and psychic driving. These experiments involved torture that had been called beyond Nuremberg by the American Bar Association. To the obviously frightfully twisted Ewan Cameron, a former prison psychologist, Canada's prisons seemed to be the ideal testing ground for LSD experiments administered to unwitting inmates. In this particular lawsuit, a total of 23 female inmates at the now defunct Federal Prison for Women in Kingston were administered LSD as part of a study. One such victim was 18 at the time of her victimization. She received at least one extremely powerful dose of LSD and was put in a 5-foot by 7.5-foot windowless cell lit only by a single light bulb, with only a mattress on the floor and a hole in which she could pass bodily waste. Such treatment allegedly caused not only brain damage to this individual, but subsequently this person experienced lasting, terrifying hallucinations. Another brainwashing victim of the CIA and Ewan Cameron was awarded $100,000 after receiving successive controversial electroshock treatments in a Montreal psychiatric institute. The shock treatment turned the victim, a then 19-year-old honor student, into a crazed woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed from a bottle, and urinated on the floor. All of these experiments supposedly were to create mind control slaves. One question I have: who authorized the government to produce mind control slaves? I didn't. Did you? Although the MKUltra program was supposedly ended in 1973, there's a mountain of evidence and victim testimonies that can prove beyond any doubt that this program or similar, even more draconian, illegal interventions are alive and well to this day. They simply went underground, where no oversight of any kind could save these poor victims.
In a description offered by Ellen P. Lachter, Ph.D., a psychologist with 17 years' experience working with mind control victims, she writes, quote, "Torture-based mind control programming can be defined as systematic torture that blocks the victim's capacity for conscious processing through pain, terror, drugs, illusion, sensory deprivation, sensory overstimulation, oxygen deprivation, cold, heat, spinning, brain stimulation, and often near death, and then employs suggestion and/or conditioning to implant thoughts, directives, and perceptions in the unconscious mind, often in newly formed trauma-induced dissociated identities that force the victim to do, feel, think, or perceive things for the purposes of the programmer. The objective is for the victim to follow directives with no conscious awareness, including execution of acts in clear violation of the victim's volition, moral principles, and spiritual convictions." End quote.
This abuse usually starts in early childhood. Practitioners of this dark art include any psychopath wishing to use children in religious rituals, organized crimes such as child pornography, prostitution, and human trafficking, or groups with political, military, or espionage agendas.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that, quote, the end justifies the means, and, quote, I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. The saddest part is, I know for a fact that I was not alone. There were countless other children in my same situation, and there was no one to help us until now. I've already submitted as much information as possible, including conversations overheard of the people, agencies responsible. I'm able to report all this to you in such detail because of my photographic memory and the arrogance of the doctors, the arrogance of the people involved. They were certain they would always control my mind. Although the process of recalling these atrocities is not an easy one, nor is it without some danger to myself and my family, I feel the risk is worth taking. Dr. L. Wilson Green, who claimed to have received $50 million from the Edgewood Chemical and Radiology Laboratory as part of the TSD, or Technical Science Division of the CIA, once described to Dr. Charles Brown that, quote, children were used as subjects because they were more fun to work with and cheaper, too. They needed lower profile subjects than soldiers or government people, so only young, willing females would do. Besides, he said, I like scaring them. They in the agency think I'm a god, creating subjects experiments for whatever deviant purposes Sid and James can think up. Sid being Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, James, Dr. James Hamilton. In 1958, I was to be tested, they told me, by some important doctors from the society, or the Human Ecology Society, and I was instructed to cooperate. I was told not to look at anyone's faces and not try hard not to ignore any names, as this was a very secret project. But I was told to be brave, and all these things would help me forget. Naturally, as most children do, I did the opposite and remembered as much as I could. Dr. John Gittinger tested me, Dr. Cameron gave me the shocks, and Dr. Green the x-rays. Then I was told by Sid Gottlieb that, quote, I was ripe for the big A, or meaning artichoke. By the time I left to go home, just like every time from then on, I would remember only whatever explanations Dr. Robert G. Heath of Tulane Medical University gave me for the odd bruises, needle marks, burns on my head, fingers, and even the genital soreness. I had no reason to believe otherwise. They had already begun to control my mind. The next year, I was sent to a lodge in Maryland called Deep Creek Cabins to learn how to sexually please men. I was taught how to coerce them into talking about themselves, and it was Richard Helms, who was deputy director of the CIA, Dr. Gottlieb, Captain George White, Morris Allen, who all planned on filming as many high government agency officials and heads of academic institutions and foundations as possible, so that later when the funding for mind control and radiation started to dwindle, projects would continue. I was used to entrap many unwitting men, including themselves, all with the use of a hidden camera. I was only 9 years old when this sexual humiliation began. I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, which I found out was Office of Research and Development. It was run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Martin Orne, and Morris Allen. Once a crude remark was made by Dr. Gottlieb about a certain possible leak over New Orleans East involving a large group of retarded children who are being given massive doses of radiation. He asked, why was Wilson so worried about a few retarded kids? After all, they would be the least likely to spill the beans. Another time, I heard Dr. Martin Orne, who was the director then of the scientific office and later the head of the Institute for Experimental Research, state that, quote, in order to keep more funding coming from different sources for radiation and mind control projects, he suggested stepping up the amounts of stressors used and also the blackmail portion of the experiments. He said it needed to be done faster than to get rid of the subjects, or they were asking for us to come back later and haunt them with our remembrances. It is because of the cumulative effects of exposure to radiation, chemicals, drugs, pain, and subsequent mental and physical distress that I've been robbed of the ability to work and even to bear any children of my own. It is blatantly obvious that none of this was needed, nor should it ever have been allowed to take place at all.
Psychopaths focus on their victims' capacity to form disassociated self-states in response to extreme pain and terror. These abusers use torture to coerce their victims' psyches into forming new disassociated self states that they can work to exploit. They use torture, hypnosis, and behavioral conditioning to create in their victims disassociated self states that will serve the functions defined by the psychopath along with his or her funding agency, usually one of the deep state controlled spy agencies or their many contractors. In these scenarios, the victim, usually a child, starting usually before the age of 6, is subject to extreme abuse. They can only find relief by creating alternative personalities to deal with each particular depraved experience to which he or she is exposed. In addition, the torturer can compel the victim to create alters for their specific purposes. For example, to create a super soldier, an alter where fear is never experienced. A sex slave might require sex kitten programming. An assassin might require psychopathic alters to heartlessly murder on behalf of their controlling handler. Most individual mind control victims have at least one alter custom-made for demonic possession. Victims are usually women in this program, but the program also contains men. One famous example of a victim is Kathy O'Brien.
When I was really little, as far back as I can remember, I was sexually abused. And the sexual abuse went into child pornography. But as a little child, it was so natural to me to be in a sexual mode all the time that reaching out when I saw someone aroused was just a normal thing for me to do. My sexuality was never suppressed. I was never told that's wrong. I was never, it was encouraged. So I just grew up thinking that was the norm.
With the abuse that I went through, it was as though my spirit was removed from it, like it took flight. It was a safe place. One that was actually in flow while my body was being directed by other people and ended up, being involved in things I had no way I ever would have participated in.
It was early evening when they played Most Dangerous Game.
I was stripped of my clothing. I was allowed to wear tennis shoes and told that I could have a head start and begin running before I would be hunted down. My exposure to it resulted in my believing I had no place to run and no place to hide. It seemed there were no limits to what could happen in my existence at that time.
It was one of the most extreme situations I think I ever survived.
When I was a really young child growing up in Muskegon, Michigan, this would be the early 60s. I was born in 1957. My father had been sexually abusing me as far back as I can remember. And he often bragged of substituting his penis for my mother's nipple while I was an infant. So my sexuality was heightened from a very, very early age. And I also developed what is known as dissociative identity disorder. It was formerly termed multiple personality disorder, but has since been redefined because it's not multiple personalities, but the shattering of a personality and a compartmentalization of memory, of trauma, too horrible to comprehend. Childhood sexual abuse is certainly too horrible to comprehend. There was no place for that in my mind. This compartmentalization of memory was what the government was interested in because they figured that if a person couldn't think to bring to mind abuse, they wouldn't be able to think to bring to mind government secrets, government perversions, or anything else they wanted compartmentalized in the brain. My experience as a mind control slave on a White House Pentagon level was extreme. I was totally robotic. I had no capacity to think for myself. I didn't have any free thought whatsoever. I didn't even have the ability to question, to reason, or consciously comprehend what I was involved in.
A less well-known, but also an interesting case, is that of Sandy Bergen, who is also to this day a targeted individual.
Your name again?
I was born Sandy Bergen, November 15, 1959, in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And there was an Air Force base less than 5 miles away from that hospital. And I was taken back to the hospital when I was 3 years old. My mother put me in a I was not sick that morning, and she wrapped me in a blanket and rocked me in her arms and took me to the hospital, and they put me in a cage. And I always remembered it as what I thought was 3 to 4 days, but through the extensive therapy, I know it was much longer. And I never forgot a lot of parts of that hospital stay, and other ones started flashing back when I had what I call my awakening in December of 2012, when it was like a bag was taken off my head and I was being led to information and websites and books, and I started putting the pieces of the puzzle together of the horrible childhood that I had with all of the sexual abuse and the hospital stay, which I'd like to describe. The hospital stay, that would have been in about 1969. I was about 3 years old. I was put in a cage. There was never any vitals taken. Other children were in cages around me, and we were let out of the cages to go in the play corner to play with blocks and puzzles and numbers. And the only visit from my parents in those days that I was there was when they came and they brought me puzzles. And I sat in that cage and I solved them 1, 2, 3. And that's what the brain is prepared for the fragmentation through the puzzles and symbols, and they put the commands in. Right after the hospital stay, my cousin was spending the night. He's about my age or a year younger than me, actually. And I was very excited. My cousin was spending the night, and they put him in bed with me. And I remember the first time I woke up, and it was a rough hand fondling me, and I remember thinking it felt good and it felt familiar. And through now my extensive therapy, I've seen that they sexually abused me, would wake me up in the cage just like that. And I remember my eyes popping open, and I was like, ooh, this feels good. And it did feel familiar, and it went on for years. By the time I was 6, 7 years old, I knew my cousin's penis. I mean, we were having all kinds of sexual night after night. My brother, 3 years older than me, molested me most of my childhood, and I had blocked that out. And then I started remembering, and I called my brother and I said, do you remember when you undressed me in Mom and Dad's bed? And he goes, oh no, that was in the tent. And then boom, I had probably 20 incidences that I started remembering that I had blocked out. And my brother always through my childhood would call me names and sing songs, fat songs about me. And I had no self-esteem time I was an adult. And I remember when I was in 2nd grade, so Anna, you asked me what 2nd grade would have been, 6, 7 years old, and I was down the street, and I was in bed naked with a boy 3 years older than me, and he was trying to put his penis in my butt. And his mom opened the door, stormed open the door, and I remember being embarrassed and disappointed because that's what I thought I was. And I would be triggered to go through drawers as a child, and I went in my dad's drawer, and right on top was I was probably 7 years old, was a big, thick pornography book with graphic cartoons with, grandpa with granddaughter and sex with animals. And that was my go-to toy as a child. And I'm pretty sure that they suck off of your sexual energy. Sharon, I called her the Madame. I think she's a Madame. She took us on a tour of the Ford factory, her and her sons, myself and her sons, and it was a private tour. And we went in a side door, and they had us stop and look this way and look that way. And from reading what Kathy O'Brien said, that the perpetrators of this like to see their victims out of the bedroom scene. And I realized that my first cousin, Rich, ended up working for Ford's. The cousin that I had all that sex with works for Ford's now, and the Fords are big in Michigan, and I'm pretty sure that they supported this program, this nefarious program.
You're talking about the Ford Motor Company?
Ford. Gerald Ford went right to Kathy O'Brien's house.
Oh,
when she was
the president.
Yes, exactly. And
according to Schaefer, R.E. and Cozzolino, L.J., 1992, In a report entitled Adults Who Report Childhood Ritualistic Abuse, published in the Journal of Psychology and Theology. Here are some common types of abuse used in torture-based mind control programming.
As I said before, these programs went dark in 1974, which means that there currently is no accountability, oversight, or moral limitations on the atrocities committed by the psychopaths now in charge of the program, working for what we now know as the sociopathic deep state matrix. The Tavistock Institute, which can be regarded as the greatest brainwashing organization to ever exist in the course of human history, was dedicated to the study of trauma-based mind control, beginning by studying shell-shocked British soldiers in World War II. The firebombing of innocent civilians in Dresden was said to be one of its first endeavors, designed and executed exclusively to test the effects of the devastation on the civilian population. It was well known at that point that Germany had essentially lost the war and was not a danger to the world. In this particular atrocity, civilian encampments were hit, not military targets, killing over 125,000 people, which were mostly older men, women, and children. Which leads me to wonder about the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, since in the Pacific, the Allies had already defeated the Japanese before these devastating weapons were dropped. To this day, there are many speculations as to why these weapons were used on civilians, with obviously no military purpose. What the human species can stand in terms of torture, depravity, and trauma is of great interest to this day to the Tavistock Institute and the satanic psychopaths that rule the world. Tavistock, the nerve center for the global manipulation of human consciousness, represents the embryonic stage of all the subsequent satanic trauma-based programs. Beginning with experimenting with microwave weapons to control populations, through the MK Ultra mind control programs, through today's asymmetrical warfare victims being electronically tortured in their homes, to the psychological torture and control of all humanity through smart technology, nanoparticles, microwaves, HAARP pulses, cell towers, and other high-tech devices. Tavistock lurks in the background.
As alluded to earlier in this video, the torture prison at Guantanamo Bay was, and still is, obviously maintained for other reasons, other than the stated purpose of gleaning information from prisoners to help protect the fatherland. Or should I say, homeland. As you might remember, the individuals held in this blight on human dignity might not have even been terrorists, let alone anyone with critical information. They could more rightly be called the most unlucky of the unlucky. That characterization was confirmed in an email by Thomas Berg, staff judge advocate for the Joint Task Force. He stated that, quote, "I can understand why a lot of people were scraped up from the battlefield and brought to Gitmo because we didn't know what we had, but we didn't have any real mechanisms to sort them out. And I think once we started sorting them out, we'd already stated publicly that we had, quote, the worst of the worst, unquote. And it was a little hard to go against that and say, well, maybe some of them aren't quite the worst of the worst, and some of them are just the slowest guys off the battlefield, unquote.
Reading from a report entitled Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab, published by Seton Hall Law University, School of Law Center for Policy and Research, the real role of torture at Guantanamo is revealed. Quote, the stated intended purpose of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center was to house the most dangerous detainees captured in the course of the global war on terrorism. Founded in 2002, the commander in charge of detention operations, Brigadier General Rick Backus, effectively operated the camp as a facility for housing prisoners of war. As POWs, the detainees were entitled to basic human rights afforded under the Geneva Conventions. Pursuant to typical military command structure, Brigadier General Backus answered to the United States Southern Command, SOUTHCOM. Little did he know, however, the executive branch had created a second, secret chain of command, forging direct access between intelligence officers to the President of the United States. The intelligence commander and head of the second chain of command, Major General Michael E. Dunleavy, received his marching orders directly from President George W. Bush. These orders commanded Major General Dunleavy to debrief Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld once a week, in person, on matters of intelligence, which avoided placing any record of their discussions in written form. Major General Dunleavy's predecessor, Major General Miller, also reported daily to the Secretary of Defense, once per week by telephone. This arrangement operated beyond the scope of the established military chain of command. What was it that the executive branch was so eager to gain from intelligence at Gitmo? The continued pressure effectively created Gitmo's alter ego. Out of it emerged America's, quote, battle lab, end quote. Every lab must have its test subjects, and Gitmo was no different. Its rats were human beings, detainees. Instead of receiving POW treatment, the detainees underwent a level of interrogation overwhelmingly condemned by federal government agencies at the time and criticized by all the agencies involved in intelligence gathering. When the FBI expressed concern over the legality of some interrogation techniques, the agents were told by intelligence officials at Gitmo to act like, quote, guests that they were. Soon, all personnel not connected with intelligence gathering became guests at the base, unwelcome in many areas of the camp. Brigadier General Backus was muscled out of the facility when his complaints regarding detainee treatment began to interfere with the intelligence mission. Soon after this, all operations were consolidated into a joint task force under the direct supervision of Intelligence Commander Major General Miller. The criticized torture tactics, known as enhanced interrogation techniques, were not utilized for the purpose of obtaining reliable information. Instead, the quote results the executive branch was searching for was something much more sinister. The government sought information on the most effective ways to torture a human physically, information on the most damaging ways to break a man psychologically, and insight as to just how far the human body could be pushed in pain and terror before organ failure or death. Upon arrival, the detainees were routinely given psychosis-inducing drugs and were held in isolation for up to 30 days without access to human contact, including the International Committee of Red Cross. Once in Gitmo, non-compliant detainees could also be subject to isolation techniques, which triggered denial of access both to doctors and Red Cross representatives. When detainees underwent torture, medics monitored their vital signs to ensure that there was no organ failure or death. The policy implemented at the camp was that if a detainee's pulse dropped below 40 beats per minute, the interrogation had to stop until his pulse was raised to 41 beats per minute. Medics would also draw blood to determine how close each detainee was to kidney failure from the interrogations. In addition, the Department of Defense encouraged the use of psychological interrogation tactics, in addition to physical abuse. Intelligence also toyed with detainees' health through the use of mefloquine, an anti-malarial medication, at doses known to induce anxiety, paranoia, and other mental harm. The FBI reported numerous interrogation techniques exploiting psychological weaknesses and preying on the detainees' Muslim faith. Gitmo existed as a place where, quote, intel could push nearly all the boundaries of torture without fear of liability. It placed the intelligence mission at the forefront, demoting any interests of the detention mission. In doing so, the laboratory was formed, paving the way for a multitude of psychological experiments against detainees who were admittedly not, quote, the worst of the worst, but were in fact merely low-level enemy combatants. Gitmo operated as a battle lab, a world where the experimentation on the defenseless served to generate data with which to counsel and train interrogators at military facilities across the earth. These bases utilized the insight granted by intelligence officers from Gitmo, most notably Bagram and Abu Ghraib. With Gitmo serving as the command center for worldwide interrogation coordination, the laboratory could utilize the results of the torture testing in training future interrogators in different theaters of war. After multiple Senate investigations and the declassification of many documents, the world can now see that Gitmo was no simple POW detention center, but was instead operated as America's battle laboratory. So now we know that Gitmo was run to torture individuals, to find out human limitations to torture. It was made to report directly to the President through daily personal briefings with the Secretary of Defense. Why were these two parties, Bush and Rumsfeld, directly interested in the torture going on in Guantanamo, since it was obviously not for national security interests? Could there be a satanic connection? Could this prison also be for the harvesting of low-level energetic vibrations? Keep in mind, Skull and Bones is definitely connected. As a lead-up to globalization, it's obviously necessary to perfect techniques of torture to terrorize and eventually eliminate anyone that might present opposition to the grand satanic design. A well-known incarnation of this technique of extreme fear-based control, wielded by fascist states, came into public awareness through the activities of the German Stasi and the Red Terror in Russia under the Bolshevik Cheka, which ran an arrest, internment, and execution campaign that institutionalized the Gulag prison system. In America, this fear-based mind control program of torture and execution was rolled out and perfected for use against Americans and citizens worldwide in South Vietnam, in a program known as the Phoenix Program.
In Vietnam from 1965 to 1968, the U.S. intelligence services maintained an active list of VC cadre marked for assassination, calling for neutralizing 1,800 targets a month. A third of these VC were summarily executed. Security committees and provincial interrogation centers determined the fate of VC suspects outside of judicial controls. Green Berets and Navy SEALs would assassinate suspected VC sympathizers or cadres, assassinating, for example, Cambodian officials suspected of collaborating with the North Vietnamese, or South Vietnamese suspected as collaborators and double agents. In 1982, an ex-Phoenix operative revealed that sometimes orders were given to kill U.S. military personnel who were considered security risks. He suspects the order came not from division, but from a higher authority, such as the CIA or the Office of Naval Intelligence. The following testimony is from Vincent Okamoto, combat officer, a lieutenant in Vietnam in 1968, and recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award conferred by the U.S. Army, wounded 3 times. Quote, "The problem was, how do you find the people on the blacklist? It's not like you had their address and telephone number. The procedure would be to go into a village and just grab someone and say, 'Where's Win so-and-so?' Half the time the people were so afraid they would say anything. Then a Phoenix team would take the informant, put a sandbag over his head, poke out 2 holes so he could see, put Como wire around his neck like a long leash, and walk him through the village and say, 'When we go by Win's house, scratch your head.' Then that night, Phoenix would come back, knock on the door, and say, 'April Fool, motherfucker.' Whoever answered the door would get wasted. As far as they were concerned, whoever answered was a communist, including family members. Sometimes they'd come back to camp with ears to prove that they had killed people." One of the Phoenix program architects, Robert Comer, after leaving the Pentagon said, quote, I would have done a lot of things differently and been more cautious about getting us involved. He called the war a strategic disaster which cost us 57,000 lives and $500 billion. Comer then worked as a consultant for the RAND Corporation, writing classified studies on NATO and on the need for a rapid deployment force for the Persian Gulf. In Vietnam, there were 3 existing programs. The Hamlet Information Program. CIA and Special Branch recruited informants in the hamlets. Some informants were blackmailed. Others did it for revenge. Money was the most common motivating factor used in recruiting people as informants. Under the Provincial Interrogation Program, the CIA began building a secret torture chamber in each of South Vietnam's 44 provinces in 1964. Finally, penetrations into the Viet Cong infrastructure using blackmail or terrorizing a member of the targeted individual's family was used to gather information. Every Vietnamese over the age of 15 had to register and carry identity cards. These records were computerized, eventually evolving into a highly computerized and statistical means of generating 1,800 names a month for the target list and coordinating the information from 30,000 or more informants on who was a VC cadre or sympathizer. When the Strategic Hamlet program failed, CIA and military intelligence concentrated on the Phoenix program, a terror campaign aimed at the civilian population instead of winning hearts and minds, to win by using the threat of assassination and a terror state to defeat the North Vietnamese. Many non-political Vietnamese were arrested and tortured and in effect forced into the resistance army of the North.
The Phoenix fear-invoking torture and execution program, in which capturing, terrorizing, torturing, and assassinating suspected Viet Cong sympathizers, along with millions of innocent civilians, in a systematic manner, worked well in the eyes of the psychopathic elites. Therefore, this program became the satanic elite's blueprint for the current deep state black operation mechanism, known as no-touch torture, or asymmetric warfare. In its modern incarnation, this atrocity includes gang stalking, use of directed energy weapons, thought and mind control techniques, and today is currently targeting millions of innocent civilians worldwide. The indiscriminate killing of the Phoenix program continues on American soil. The terms soft kill, slow kill, and silent kill refer to a new way of killing the enemy in conflicts short of war and in small wars in the future. The counterinsurgency doctrine has now been applied to the home front. The generation of CIA and military intelligence led by Theodore Shackley, Richard Helms, William Casey, John Singlaub, Richard Secord, John B. Alexander, Michael Aquino, Paul Vallely, and others have built the perfect beast using selective assassination that leaves no trace. The ability to cull the human herd with, quote, silent kill, end quote, technology allows a few personalities to remake the entire society in their own image. Extremely low frequency ELF technology slowly drives the target crazy with silent sound, similar to the CIA MKUltra psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron's psychic driving technique, used to break down the target's personality. The new buzzwords at the Pentagon are synthetic telepathy and psychotronics. Another means of attack on targets is the Smirnoff patent that uses subliminal suggestions to manipulate human behavior. This patent was purchased by the remote viewing company SciTech Corporation. Military intelligence officers involved in developing these, quote, non-lethal weapons also control SciTech. Emotional manipulation is accomplished using Dr. Michael Persinger's work to remotely project emotional states that the brain entrains or locks onto and emulates. One can broadcast rage or fear at an individual target to manipulate and control them. As if these methods were not enough to torture and murder people, add to this nightmarish toolbox active gang stalking. CIA-created cults and other cause-oriented groups are used by actively harassing them in public in neutralization techniques described in counterintelligence operation manuals that are aimed at enemy agents. In the race to develop a new weapon, it's always been necessary to test it on human beings. Perfecting the latest weapons designed to kill slowly and silently, as well as perfecting the process of controlling the human mind, are no different. Once the weaponry has been perfected, the same techniques will be applied en masse to the general population and then to humanity as a whole.
Well, this is you know, in the design of the Department of Homeland Security, which of course is post 9/11 operation, now with 225,000 employees and a $40 billion annual budget. They got Stasi officers, as well as Nazi officers, Gestapo officers, to help them design the Department of Homeland Security. So, you know, who is behind the gang stalking? Well, it is the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and all their fusion centers, and 78 fusion centers in every state, in which, you know, local law enforcement is all connected up with these guys. And these huge budgets, $60 billion a year for the FBI, $42 billion of which goes to outsourcing to corporate entities, you know. So you have now the corporatocracy, the private sector, doing this as well. So you got NSA, CIA, FBI, DHS, and then all the Department of Defense intelligence agencies. They're all involved in this. Right. And the technologies coming from these sectors, and again, that would be a whole nother show. You know, let's talk about where these high, you know, these directed energy weapons, when they were developed, who actually has the patent on them, and then, you know, what's the history? These are black ops. These are black projects. And now it's being turned loose on the American people to silently harass and to neutralize, discredit, actually murder, take out, eliminate targeted individuals. And so this is very dark. I mean, this is, if you look at it, Well, let me just give a couple books, several books for people. I really want to share this information with people who may be targeted individuals, and reach out to the people who are not targeted so that they might see what has happened to our Bill of Rights in this country. You know, basically these programs eliminate the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, as well as your freedom of speech. They surveil you, etc. So our whole nation, I think, is at stake with these programs, because these are, as we said in our last interview, weapon systems that can be scaled up and scaled back. Could create a huge holocaust around the world with these very programs. It's a silent war. It's an invisible war, because directed energy weapons, of course, are not visible. And so when they talk about soft kill, slow kill, silent kill, non-lethal weapons, what we're talking about is microwave, milliwave, scalar waves, silent sound, sonar, that are coming from satellites. They're coming from Gwen Towers. They're coming from HARP, the High Active Frequency Auroral Research Project in Alaska, and the other 20-some ionospheric heaters around the world, HARP being the largest. And they come from portable devices. They have portable microwave devices, radio frequency devices that can beam directly into the targeted individual's home, go through the walls, radar that goes through the walls, etc. Let me give you these books, because I think education is the very, very best antidote. It's the very best protection weapon for targeted individuals. The more you know about it, the less you're likely to be, eliminated, killed, isolated, taken out through a whole series of it's psychological warfare, it's directed energy warfare. So the books that I think are very solid and that I would recommend, I wish it was in every library in the world. Dr. John Hall is an anesthesiologist out of San Antonio, Texas, and a targeted individual. He's written 2 books, Satellite Terrorism, A New Breed of Something or Other. That's his first. The second one is the one I'm recommending, and that is Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. And in this book, he identifies 6 phases of targeting that all people who are targeted will go through. And this is a protocol now being established around the world. First of all, selection. And you can be put on these terrorist watch lists, or whatever they want to call them, notification lists at first in Britain, by anybody. In other words, if there's somebody in your community who doesn't like you and they have some contacts with the NSA or local police, they can report to you on these experiments on people of all different races and colors and ages. And so you get on the list, you are now in the program until death. Very rarely does somebody get out of the program. So they will continue to harass you until death. Okay, selection is the first. Surveillance is the second, and this can take 2 or 3 years or more. Ideally, the target does not know this is happening, and I think this is true. I think most targets don't even know they're being targeted, period. But yeah, surveillance is the second, and they'll break into your homes, and they'll hack your emails, and they'll do all kinds of things, hack your phones, etc. The third one and fourth one go together, and that's the gang stalking, sometimes called organized stalking. Vigilante neighborhood watch groups and vigilante volunteer police, and again by all these spy groups. So we have spies all over the place being paid in this country to do this. And I'm toying now with trying to figure out what the numbers are, but it must be in the millions in America. People who are actually hearing or being told a person and potentially a criminal and maybe a pedophile, maybe a prostitute, they'll lie to them and say, okay, this person is we don't quite have enough on him yet, but we have an investigation underway, and the local cop will come up to this potential perpetrator and show him a file with your picture on it and tell him a bunch of lies, and then say, we need your help, and by the way, we'll pay you, $100, for instance, just to call in a location. And so they get their little cell phone app, And there's all this list of photos, you know, in your area, and then the fusion center will have, you know, coordinated the local police and the vigilante neighborhood watch people, etc., and whatever NSA, CIA spies are actually on hand, and then again the corporate sector, the private sector. And they'll say, okay, we want you to do this and such, you know. And then this can involve all kinds of street theater and gaslighting and harassment. And again, the idea is to make the individual very, very afraid and paranoid, because now all of a sudden these total strangers are making your life miserable in a very systematic and coordinated way. Again, using protocols that go back to the East German Stasi. And that goes back to the Soviet Cheka, you know, the secret police of the Soviet Union. This is how the power elite controls the street level. In other words, if there are dissidents and whistleblowers and people that aren't getting along with the program, you can take them out this way using other people at street level. And they will, as Karen Stewart, ex-whistleblower, NSA whistleblower, and current TI says, they're drilling down into a criminal class. And they're offering them money too. So stalking is the third phase, and along with that go defamation. These people will then spread out into your community, and they'll get everybody, they'll tell them all kinds of lies about you, so that, you know, nobody wants to, you know, have any contact with you at all. So then you become isolated. Right. And of course that's the point, is to isolate the target. And to, you know, you lose your job, you lose your friends, you lose your home. Ultimately, they want to get you out on the street where they can either kill you, or maybe you're so depressed you commit suicide. And again, this program goes right back to the East German Stasi, secret police, and the Soviet Cheka. And it utilizes, and then the next fifth phase, attack, directed energy weapons. And this uses, now when the MK Ultra, 149 subprojects of MK Ultra, and I'm using that as a blanket because there were many, many mind control projects of the CIA and the DIA and the Department of Defense. You know, there was Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Search, MK Off, and MK blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, there's probably hundreds. And again, these would have involved some of our top scientists in, you know, with black budget programs. And now we're talking about the use of directed energy weapons against the individual, including voice-to-skull technologies, where they actually can insert voices in the person's head and say, you know, I'm God. I want you to go kill your mother. Right. Or kill your father, or go to this schoolyard and start shooting. Well, guess how this can be applied? Right. The shooters in America, you know, which is, of course, causing, oh, it's the terrorists, oh, it's the Muslim terrorists, you know, we got to go fight some more wars in the Middle East. Well, these voices, you know, this is coming from 1974 technology out of the CIA's own MK Ultra program. Voice-to-skull technology, or V2K. It was used in the Manchurian channelers of Eileen Cady of the Findhorn cult in Britain, where she's supposedly downloading this information from God and writing these books, several books, which of course are New Age books, as well as The Course in Miracles by Helen Schuckman at Columbia University, a PhD psychologist who was channeling a being. It said it was Jesus. So, so now the CIA, you know, they get to play God, and they get to play the devil. They get to play any role they want. You know, they say, well, you know, this is the devil speaking. Kill yourself. You know, and they can do this. The technology is such they can do this, where what you hear, and it's actually silent sound. It's not. It's going right through your auditory apparatus right into your skull, and you think it's a voice. Can be your own voice, in which case you think it's your own thoughts, right. Or it can be another voice, in which case you think somebody's talking to you. And so we're still on the six stages of the targeting, and we're in the directed energy weapons, and of course this goes on and on. But then the last phase is monitoring. So they want to monitor and see how you're doing. So, you know, we're talking about a technocracy here, a scientific dictatorship, a big brother now, but with malevolence. I mean, you know, you couldn't ask for a more satanic program than gang stalking.
Most of the targets currently are women. Some estimate that 70 to 75% of the victims are women. Here is what it looks like in real life.
Right.
So these are the two main things that I had done in that week. I had spoken to the treasurer, and I had written to senators about chemtrails. The next week, my street was filled with cars. People started parking on our street at all hours of the day and night. They waited for me as I got in the driveway. They parked right in front of my driveway and looked at me, you know, very deliberately. And as I'm pulling out to go, because I was teaching at that time at a couple of places locally, at a preschool and at an art center close by. So every time I went out to go to my jobs, I was pretty much escorted there by a joker who was parked right outside my driveway, who then proceeded to follow me and parked in front of the church where I was going to go, you know, deliver my classes. So this went on forever, and I began to realize, my God, am I under surveillance? Is this what is going on? And all sorts of other horrible things started happening very, very quickly. So I started having organized stalking within 1 week. And then within another week, literally in the middle of the night, my entire family, we were woken up by waves of thermal energy coming in through the window.
Whoa.
And this was when my daughter was sleeping in the bedroom with us, you know, in her own little bed. And all three of us were waking up at the same time in the middle of the night with extreme heat. So this was not imagined by any of us. And then one morning, very early one morning, I literally felt my brain probed. Literally, I could feel the different lobes inside my head because I felt remotely probed, and I was. And I was kind of paralyzed. I couldn't move. It was very early in the morning, and I could not move, and I could feel this going on. So these are the ghastly things that happened, and shortly after that, I started being tracked. It seemed I was being aerially stalked. There was a constant plane coming over and tracking, and every time I moved from room to room, I would hear hits on the side of the house, as if something was registering. You know, it was as if a brain print had been taken. It was as if I was being tracked by my brainwaves, which is ultimately what I read about later, and which I have come to understand is most definitely what is going on. But in addition to that, I have since been, you know, I've been sharp shot in broad daylight a couple times. So I actually have RFID tracking chips inside me. And I have seen these so-called covert operatives. They're not that covert, you know. They're using these barcode readers. With a barcode reader or a barcode scanner, I can be scanned now. This chip inside me can be scanned. So this has happened to me innumerable times in grocery stores, in retail stores, the UPS guy who drives up and who points it at me, the mailman who drives up and points it at me, because these are guys who are all acting as covert operatives for who knows who, whether it's the CIA or DHS or who knows, I don't know. But they're definitely living a double life. So in any case, to go back, so I was tracked, and the other thing I noticed about being tracked was cars began zooming into our street, and they are still doing that, although they back off every time I do something overt like this. Like right now, the cars are being very silent. They're just parking in front of my neighbor's house, and they probably, the jokers are inside my neighbor's house, because at this point, the neighbors have been taken over. But cars began zooming into the street, and you know, as I moved from room to room, these cars would go up the street with me. And at the same time, I began to feel an intense pencil of vibration being laid on my body. And so the correlation between that vibration, which was distinctly electrical, an electrical vibration laid on my body, and then the cars going up and down, began to be kind of indisputable. They would drive up, park, and hit, and this is what they did constantly. You know, so as I'm moving, and literally we are living in a sort of a square block, so it's easy for cars to go, you know, literally in a rectangle around the block and do this thing. So when you start feeling electromagnetic signals on your body, it is absolutely irrefutable. And you can actually start measuring this. But all of this took me time eventually to read about what was going on to other people, to find out that you can get meters to measure these signals, and to get a meter, which I did eventually, and which was very helpful because it measured all sorts of pulses, and I started taking readings. That first meter was stolen from my house.
Oh.
And my house was frequently broken into during the daytime. And small things would be, left in disarray. My plants, they love to come and kill my plants. I love gardening. I have a ton of plants both inside and outside. Well, in good weather, it's snowing right now. But I would find one little twig of the plant broken off, or one leaf turned brown and shriveled. Or if I had 3 plants of a certain kind, one of them would be killed. And a lot of sick, gluey stuff thrown on the walls, desecrating my boots, put on the coffee table. So it almost looks like, it's a coffee stain or something, but it's not. It's somebody has. And in my art room where I had my classes, frequently on the table I would see this gooey, sticky stuff left. I actually read that other people had had the exact same experience with this gooey, sticky stuff all over their houses.
Sure.
Yeah, so I began to realize the house was being broken into. So we changed locks initially. My husband was very supportive in the beginning, and he helped a great deal, especially the first week. He went and got me a lot of shielding and so forth. But I think his patience ran thin after a week or so of this, because I was trying to shield from these signals which were hitting me night and day. And the first week when I didn't have shielding, I thought I was going to die, because I know that what microwave radiation does, and I know the cancerous effects of microwave radiation. And literally what was happening was I was being sleep deprived, which means I was being woken up 5 times during the night, both by helicopter flyovers at specific REM cycle times during the night, as well as by people making noises outside, as well as by attacks of radiation. And I would get up in the morning, I barely slept, my hair was literally falling out. I could lift my hand to my head and my hair was falling out. I was totally nauseous. So I thought, oh my God, great, it's happening overnight, I'm getting cancer, I'm gonna die.
Oh my God.
Hi. This all started for me in 1996, actually, when a cousin said to me, Millicent, they told us that we can blame anything on you. 1997, her sister said to me, it's called assimilated controlled warfare. Then she said, the devil is playing with your mind. And when he gets through playing with you, he's going to destroy you. And when they open you up after you're dead, they'll find that all of your organs have been stressed. Keep in mind the words or the phrase, destroy you. At that point, I was just kind of going through what looked like some emotional things. I had a marriage that ended. I now know I was actually hypnotized to walk out of that marriage. Within 3 months, I was, I guess, remote controlled to quit my job. Now that didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me now. At that time, I thought I was obeying God, right? Not. Because I was the head breadwinner, and I had a daughter in college. I had a grandchild who I was legal guardian for. So it made no sense for me to quit a job at a major university that I needed the money to care for my family. But that's what I did. Again, not knowing what was happening. What I do know now is that the people around me, including those 2 women who told me that information in 1996 and 97, already knew that I had been selected for this program. Now, let me show you the deceptiveness of it all. It was set up in our area by a person who was then in the Air Force, who seemingly was telling people that this was they were setting it up as spiritual warfare. So the people who were being, quote unquote, attacked in the night were being attacked by the devil. And they were able to get free of him by fasting and praying. The only problem was that that never worked for me. My fasting and praying never got that to go away. Until finally, in 1999, I was at home on a Saturday afternoon, actually working in my hometown then, took a $13,000 cut in pay to get a job in this area. All of that was part of the setup because I was being set up in this area for people to use me for research, not just for research, but also for practice. I got a call, an invitation to dinner. That invitation was for dinner with the man who I believe is responsible for me being in the program. He did reveal yesterday by subliminal messaging that the program actually is the torture program. So you see, that's not anything either that's being used under any regular basis, but surely all the news reports tell us that it is a crime against humanity. It is a war crime for those who are using it on just civilians. The ACLU has filed a lawsuit against James L. Mitchell and John Jensen, who are the two psychologists that were contracted by the CIA to design, implement, and oversee the agency's post-9/11 torture program. The person that is doing this to me was, it seems, exposed to the seer, and that's what's in everybody's ears right now in the news when torture is brought up. Survival, resistance, escape, and evasion is what SEER stands for. And Jensen and Mitchell are responsible for, or being right now sued for, the use of that kind of torture on victims who were being held in Guantanamo Bay. So for the last, well, I'll go back. 99 was this visit. I ended up with this person. 2000, I had my first surgery, both little toes. I could not get rid of the pain under any circumstances. Surgery was the only answer. What the issue was, the doctor said, was the little bones in the middle of the little toe. And so she removed them. That was to leave the toe spongy. I was to not have any pain ever again. I go for 8 years with no pain. And all of a sudden I start having pain again, not just having pain, but I received what I knew were shots to those areas of my little toes. 2001, I have a rotator tear, which takes me to another surgery, shoulder cut open. I come away with what the MRI says was a metallic artifact. I had a doctor, my primary care physician, said to me, "I wish you had told me you were going to have surgery on that shoulder under workers' comp." She said, "I would have told you to use your own insurance because workers' comp is a tool of the devil." This is February 2001. April 2003, I'm driving down my highway and I hear a man's voice say, "They can see through your eyes. Quick, don't read the road signs." At that point, I was, I guess, alerted that something else maybe happened to me during surgery, but I was already suspicious because I got a call from one of my co-workers while I was recovering from the shoulder surgery. And she said, "Oh, I'm just out in the backyard looking up at the stars." I now know that she was trying to warn me that perhaps satellites were on me. Satellites are also called stars. Then I started having problems with my left hand. When I have surgery on the left hand, is to remove the thumb joint. Now, the most significant of these removals is that it's always they call them the basilar joint, BASLAR joint. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it? I don't ever hear about that. Have any of you ever heard about a basilar joint giving people problems? So it was in 1995, the basilar joint in my right hand was removed. That surgeon refused workers' comp. He said, "I don't deal with workers' comp." So now we are over in 2001, and now it's the basilar joint of my left hand. This doctor takes that joint out, and it seems he left a little present in there for me. In February of this year, I went to surgery to try and get that little present removed. And the doctor literally opened my hand, tapped on that thing in my hand. I had an x-ray that showed it. A radiology tech pulled me into a room in 2011. He says, "Come here, let me show you this pin in your hand." And he literally showed it to me and then printed it off for me. So I took it to her. She was going to remove it. She tapped on it, said, I can't remove it if a doctor put it in it. Hey, what she says is scar tissue. I've yet to find out if what she cut away is anything that's significant. But I do know that she closed my hand and that area is still there. So we've gone through now October 2001 with something else being put in my body. April.
Well, let's say very quickly, we're talking about two different protocols. We're talking about a slow kill protocol with directed energy weapons being used on some people, and with other people, unfortunately, like Dr. Millicent Black, there is a illegal implantation, torture, and experimentation program going on with other Americans. So we're talking at least two different protocols.
Actually, I would like to speak just to support everything that Millicent said so far. Absolutely everything. I think for people who hear it the first time, it sounds incredible, but everything she says, I've since heard from many victims, and I spent the last week working with another victim who experienced something very similar. So the only thing I would like to add, if anything, everything global.
Again, reading from Dr. Karlstrom's website. Some experts believe that organized stalking today is the modern expression of the MK-Ultra and COINTELPRO experiment programs. Others conclude that it is a vast weapons system now being secretly tested and refined through experimentation and deployed worldwide. Others warn that these programs have the potential to produce a global depopulation holocaust, a worldwide fascist slave state, and/or a world in which cyborgs replace human beings. Others trace responsibility for these programs ultimately to the, quote, cult, secret military intelligence programs, and the satanic Illuminati bloodline families who rule the nations. Even so, probably millions of targeted individuals all over the world are fighting for their very survival. No doubt, hundreds of thousands to perhaps millions of TIs worldwide have already succumbed and died as a result of these deadly technologies of covert warfare against the civilian population. So whether TIs know it or not, by combating and exposing this criminal system, they are also fighting for the very survival of our societies, and perhaps our species. For unless these perps, programs, cults, and criminals are exposed, defeated, and brought to justice, the nations and civilizations of the world will eventually be destroyed by this pernicious system.
This final torture program involves you. Again, according to Dr. Karlstrom, rather than thinking of psychopaths as mentally ill, it may be more accurate to consider them a separate subspecies of the human race. It is no exaggeration to say that while normal people are busy pursuing their activities, these characters literally sit around thinking of ways to deceive the populace into giving them control. They conceal their true objective using an ideology which includes a plan for a better world. An enemy is created which is portrayed as an obstacle to the better world. Their utopia is only possible when the enemy is removed. A portion of the population is recruited to assist in accomplishing this. Evidence suggests that the U.S. government has been entirely overthrown by a network of groups exhibiting psychopathic traits that have disguised themselves using humanitarian fronts. They are facilitating a revolution which will result in them having control of the entire world. Using the multinational force, they are waging a worldwide war against civilians to accomplish this.
Again, please keep in mind, these are our tax dollars at work. That's the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy. Then there are three major universities, of which my former employer is one of them. There are at least 5 military contractors, which include Lockheed Martin. And then there's a whole system of schools. Would you please tell me What teacher can explain to a child in the kindergarten or in the 6th grade or even as a senior how a tax dollar can be used to torture a woman, a female body, and that child be allowed to watch it? So what are we doing with the mind of that child while they or if they're using me for some military university soldier to get his master's degree or his PhD, how can he determine in his own conscience that he knows there's a woman in America who is being mistreated in this way, and I'm using her data to substantiate my dissertation? Then who are we turning out? What are we turning out in terms of people with conscience, people with morals, people with integrity? And yet all they have to do is keep quiet and get the degree.
Well, we're basically creating a whole society of sociopaths, and we are creating a society that is the opposite of what the American experiment was all about, and that's the rights of the individual. We are teaching people to worship the government as the only entity that tells you right and wrong. And that is so un-American. And that's the danger. We are turning into a civilization that is not worth saving. I have trouble praying for my country because I look around and it looks like Sodom and Gomorrah to me. And I remember that Billy Graham's wife said, if God does not judge America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. No ifs, ands, or buts, period. So I basically end up praying for the remnant, for those of us who know what's right and wrong, and care. Because these people who think that the government, this is government sanctioned murder. All I have to do is sit in my house and turn on a device, when they say to, and I'm a patriot and I'm getting paid under the table. I'm getting paid money under the table, or services, or, washing machines, new cars, gift certificates, that type of thing. These are not human. These are counterfeit humans. And I do not pray for them. I pray only that they go to judgment, and I hope it's soon. But the society is becoming one that is not worth existing. And that is a danger. And I point out to people from an intelligence analyst point of view, when you have to look at the globe, you have to look at the world. We are not the only entity in the world. If I'm looking at the United States experimenting on its own citizens, killing and torturing them, then I think, this country is a danger to mine. This country is a danger to China. This country is a danger to Russia.
Yeah.
Are we going to let them exist? And that's my question I pose to people. You have to understand this is beyond the United States. The other countries of the world are watching, and we are now number one threat. If we do this to our people, they say we'll do it to them, and they will have to act first.
Wow. But that
say increasingly critical are human limitations and human downsides. Humans are too large, humans are too heavy, too tender, humans are too slow, both physically and mentally, and we require huge logistical trains, meaning we cost way too much money to maintain, and humans have rapidly decreasing to negative value. Can you even believe this? I mean, you're hearing this, and it's got to be rather shocking, coming off of a NASA website, particularly when some of the agencies that are involved are the U.S. Air Force, DARPA, the CIA, the FBI, Southern Command, Atlantic Command, Australian Department of Defense, and other agencies. This is the corporation's agencies. We are USA Inc. We're no longer under a constitution as proclaimed in the Iron Mountain Report, which everyone should read. On stopthecrime.net, you can download it not only as the document, but you can watch the documentary, which I highly recommend. You will see how the stealth and deceptive, incrementally positioned attacks upon the Constitution have rendered us now a corporation. And we no longer have a legitimate government. We are being controlled by corporations and banks that are posing as a legitimate government, and they're not. We wouldn't have a legitimate government with the war machine stating what they were going to do on the continental United States to all the people. And this is not just in the United States. This is a global planned attack and assault with technologies beyond most people's comprehension. Everyone is buying books and ammunition, guns and ammunition, and they don't realize that the beam weapons, for example, on page 45, beam weapons increasingly prevalent. This is how they're going to attack. They talk also about, on page 9, this is very interesting and horrifying. Humans have taken over and vastly shortened evolution. They're going to direct evolution. They believe, the bankers, the global elites, believe that they have accomplished immortality. And they're doing that, again, keeping in mind that this entire document is about robots, cyborgs, and humans. They've already mapped our brains. We've just recently heard that they can transfer a human brain into machinery. So whenever they tell us that this is a new scientific discovery, we know it's been decades and decades prior to us ever finding out about these things. And they also talk about microdust as a weapon. They say that this micron-sized mechanized dust, which is distributed as an aerosol and inhaled into the lungs, the dust mechanically bores into the lung tissue and executes various pathological missions. They say it's a completely new type of warfare, and it is legal. It's legal. This is what they're going to do to all the humans on the face of this planet. It's all legal. And then they talk about how the use of frequencies will be used in warfare. And we know, for example, the smart meters that are being deployed around the globe, the replacement of our electric meters, which will also and does include the replacement of all of our gas meters and our water meters as well, and will be connected to our food supply when they collapse the currency and they issue energy allowances, and that will all be controlled through the metering system. But they talk about the use of low frequencies, microwave frequencies, and they mention in this NASA document the U.S. Army report. The U.S. Army report is on our website, smartmetersmurder.com. It's about a 20-page Army document that talks about the use of frequencies to target the enemy. We're the enemy. And they say 100% of the human population will be affected by these frequencies. Some will be the canaries in the coal mine, which is a term that they've been using as people have been dropping like flies. People are experiencing all kinds of health maladies. Generally, it starts with ringing of the ears, heart palpitations, skin rashes, inability to sleep through the night. And what they're doing is they're jamming our immune systems with these frequencies. It all lines up. Everything lines up. You connect the dots. You see the NASA war document. Not only does it talk about the effects of frequencies and how it will be used, they acknowledge that it will interfere with our performance, that it will cause seizures. They acknowledge this in this document. It is no longer a debate about smart meters. We don't need any more scientists or doctors saying people are getting sick. This is the intention. So we have to stop looking for more verifiable proof that people are becoming sick. This is the goal. This is the absolute goal. It's incarceration, it is enslavement, and it is depopulation. And it is massive mind control. The frequencies have multiple purposes. The Silent Weapons Quiet Wars document, it's a 41-page document. It's on our website. This lays out, it's an operations, research, and technical manual. This document was the 1954 a 1954 Bilderberg policy at the first Bilderberg meeting. And this laid out the strategy to control the human population. And again, I can't stress enough that everyone should read this, because they talk about how they talk about that this document should not be released to the people because it is a declaration of war.
You can't keep fighting fires. You have to go after the arsonists, and that's what you're pointing out, is the people that are responsible. And everything we see out there, what they're spraying and why are they spraying, nobody's talking about the conspiracy itself. This is a war against the people, and this, you've got a hold of those specific people, and that's why that's valuable. They're killing us.
That's exactly right. And this is their war plan. This is the war plan. So we have to go to the war plan. This is only 41 pages. You take out the diagrams and you've got 36 pages. And it's not hard to read. They say that it's the silent weapon technology has evolved from operations research, a strategic and tactical developed under the military management in England during World War II. The original purpose of this research was to study strategic and tactical problems of air and land defense with objective effectiveness used in initiated military resources against foreign enemies. And they go on to talk about how they came across technologies that they had. Oh, in 1952, the grant period terminated, and the high-level meeting of the elite was held to determine the next phase of the social operations research. The Harvard project had been very fruitful, as is borne out by the publication of some of the results in 1953, suggesting the feasibility of economic engineering, studies of structure of the American economy. And they talk about how it was engineered in the last half of the 1940s. The new quiet war machine stood, so to speak, in sparkling gold-plated hardware on the showroom floor by 1954. So this document talks about a combination of irresistible attacks upon humanity and how they will control humanity. Politically, they talk about how they set up the political system right and left so that we would feel our grievances were aired and our frustrations could come out. But the bankers were behind everyone who was elected, and they laugh at us. They laugh at us. The very, very last, and I'll go to this right now because we'll come back to the document itself, but the very last statement in this document, it says, Factor 6, cattle. Those who will not use their brains are no better off than those who have no brains. And so this mindless school of jellyfish, father, mother, son, and daughter, become useful beasts of burden, or trainers of the same. So what they say in this document is they will dole out poisonous foods. It's not what we need, but it's what we want. And those that decide to eat these foods will have the consequences of that. They tell us how they set up all the social engineering, how they devise the family, how they crumble the family, how they set up the war machine, how they influence thinking in the family unit to allow the family to give up their children to war for a rich man's fodder. It's a document that discusses the artificial womb. They believe that people need to feel protected, and that the elites are going to serve as the womb for protection of the people, that they'll have a place to take cover and hide from the reality of life, because we just are not capable of managing the reality of life. So they will set up that artificial womb. It says, the objective of these artificial wombs is to provide a stable environment for both stable and unstable activity, to provide a shelter for the evolutionary process of growth and maturity. Survival, to provide security for freedom, and to provide defensive protection for offensive activity. And they say that from the time a person leaves its mother's womb, in every effort is directed towards building, maintaining, and withdrawing into artificial wombs various sorts of substitute protective devices or shells. So they set themselves up to protect us, to keep us crippled, to numb us down with foods so that our pineal gland is interfered with. We're never able to reach our higher consciousness. And right now, the massive fluoridation across the United States is to collapse the ability for us to think. They're shutting us down right now.
Do you think revolution would be necessary at some point, or could it change without that? What do you think?
Well, I think we need a revelation, not a revolution. A revolution would only bring in martial law, in the opinion of what we are looking at, would bring in martial law. It would also allow people to be targeted with the weaponry that they cannot wait to roll out on us. You add the drones, you add the microdust, you add in the beam weapons that they tell us they have. All the documents, the Iron Mountain document, even the NASA war document, talks about there are too many people using too much stuff, and the Earth cannot support this. And they've come up with the fear-based scientific fraudulent information that people are now accepting. They're rewriting history and they're rewriting science with the idea that people are using too much resources. We have to reduce CO2 and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And that is flying through every city across the world right now. It's written into all local government documents, and cities now are, well, California, for example, with the CARB initiative, where we have to actually pay for the air we breathe, and we're taxed for the air. It's like the fiat money. We've accepted false-backed money, which they tell us in the Iron document, or in the Silent Weapons document. One of the reasons that they send our men and women off to war is to reduce the population, because they have stolen from them. They've taken real labor service in exchange for illegitimate false fiat money. So they have to eliminate the creditors. That's another aspect of war, is to reduce the creditors. But it's all based on the false pollution that is not false. They've created the pollution. When you look at the Iron Mountain document, you will see the methods in which they were going to create pollution. They even say that they will deforest us, and they're doing that with the chemtrail, the secret chemtrail or geoengineering program or weather modification. Actually, that program has multiple layers. Not only does it increase weather events, we've just experienced some horrific events here in the United States with massive tornadoes that just destroyed a number of cities in Oklahoma. We're being hit globally. They're hitting our food supply. It does reduce our food supply. It will increase the cost of our food. It's changing the pH in the soil, which will then fit to the prescribed Monsanto mega corporation food takeover of the globe. That is the intention of Monsanto, is global food domination. They have the seeds. The seeds will grow in the polluted soil that they are creating. This is all by design. So what do we do about this, you asked? We first must become educated. And I would say that the quickest way for people to become educated is look at these very simple source documents. Look at the Quiet Weapons Silent War document. Look at the Iron Mountain document and the New World Order Exposed 1969. They're all on our website, stopthecrime.net. Of all the research we have done, if you just get those basic documents understood, if everyone understands the fraud, then we will be able to eliminate this. We don't have to go on with this fraud. We do not. And people keep saying, well, there's more of us than them. Well, that may be true. But sadly, now, there are technologies that are so unbelievable that people won't even realize what hit them. And that is the strategy of the future wars and the wars that we're facing in our country. But I would say everyone needs to look at the NASA document. You need to move from the illusion, the non-reality that you are living in. You need to move into a new reality formed by the truths that these documents convey, so that then from those realities, then you can look at solutions. You can't shoot from the hip and look for solutions if you have not learned who's doing this to us, how they're doing this to us, and the documents that tell us how they are doing this to us.
Like the Truman Show, which was designed to create a false reality for entertainment, the false reality we have now is designed to kill us. This is a war against the people. This is why that tabloid came out, Prepare to Die. And they're doing it in so many deliberate ways in which those documents show that it's been in the works for a long time. And you not only see the individuals, which could be kind of identified with the Bilderbergers, the Trilats, and Skull and Bones. They are in the saddle. They are the ones determining policy, the scientific advisor to the president of the John P. Holdren in charge of the chemtrails. We have MITRE with the former head of the CIA directing all these branches of government. We've got guys like Leon Panetta, which is the head of the CIA and the Department of Defense, moving our armies over to NATO and moving without a constitution. This is a direct war against us, and we see people dying like flies now. And like you said, it doesn't have fingerprints on it because of the methods that they're using, but it's as real as people getting strokes and cancer and autism and Alzheimer's. It's so clear. I mean, the stats, the mathematics prove the point. And so they have to know, people have to know what's going on to strategize to fight it. And they can, because the only way they're getting away with this is by the lies. And if you succumb to the mass media, the three networks, and the two wire services, you're never going to get out of it.
Well, it actually says in the document, in the NASA war document, that they will use mass media propaganda. That is prevalent.
CNN syndrome, is that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that they call it. But they're literally going through this document. Oh, they're going to also use explosive dust opportunities. They talk about how, the dust will infiltrate deeply into buried and other such targets. They're saying in here too, if you move, they can see you and you're dead. So the technology, sensors in everything. There is an amazing mission statement that I found on PSI technology out of the Carnegie Mellon Institute. And the mission statement stated that they were changing the global infrastructure to that of computers and technology, and that would include our entire structure, not only utilities, but civil, government policies. And what is also very interesting, we went to Al Gore's recent book review. He wrote a book called The Future, and he talks about how artificial intelligence is going to take over, and that we're going to see changes within the United States that have not been seen in 500 years. And he talks about how it's just not efficient to continue with humans. The same thing. These all tie in. They all tie in. We have a think tank that is plotting and scheming against humanity because they believe that it's too frail. And they talk about the U.S. Brain Project, and it begun in the 90s. They say that it was funded by 16 organizations across 5 agencies. NIH, which of course is the National Health Institute, the Department of Defense, NASA, and the Department of Energy. And they talk about how they have over 10,000 individual presentations at annual meetings for the Society for Neuroscience. And essentially, they have redesigned humanity. The levels of technology, the length of time that they've had technologies are unbelievable. What they also say in the Iron Mountain documentary is that they will control the educational system, that they will replace the education system with computers. They're saying that in the NASA document too. Everything will be telecommuting, teleshopping, tele-entertainment, tele-travel, tele-education. This way they can rewrite history. Everything will be on Kindle, and it'll be very easy to change books, to change the language. So they're rewriting our vocabulary. They're rewriting everything about us. And they're keeping us so sick from the fluoride, from the aspartame in the food, all of the dyes and chemicals on everything. I mean, even the receipts that we get from filling our cars with gas are poisonous. We shouldn't be touching them. And so we need to navigate. I say that life on a daily basis is like trying to walk through a landmine field. And if you get to the other side at the end of the day, you've made good choices, because they've certainly put and placed landmines in our lives.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid, really. I mean,
The impact that it's having on our lives, that we should be sitting here right now having this conversation because of what has been orchestrated against us. Our futures are being determined for us. Our lifespans are being decided upon. So we are in a takedown of frequencies admitted by this document. We have the proof. We have the military, the agencies that admit to this. We don't need to prove the deaths on the campuses near towers, because it says towers will be used on page 98. It says that towers will be used to emit frequencies. So again, this is their document. This is what they tell us on page 98. A typical scenario: takedown of the U.S. by 10 people and $10 million. Binary biologicals, imported vitamins and clothing, the food supply will be poisoned, terror attacks with vaccines and with viruses. They talk about our railroads will be attacked, selective anti-personnel with radiation frequencies, microwaves from the towers. The water supply will be contaminated via intercontinental unmanned vehicles, accompanied by serious psy-war, and that's the CNN syndrome. So they're telling us here how easy it would be to take down the United States with these new technologies. We've got to expose this. And what it said, which was quite shocking, on page 93, it said, capture, torture Americans in living color on prime time. And that is an unbelievable statement.
There's a channel that was called Daddy05, and it has over 760,000 subscribers. That's, gosh, a lot of subscribers, right? You know, they're on their way to 1 million subscribers. Their entire show had to do with pranking their children on tape. And I guess people say at first the pranks were normal or something, but as the channel continued, these things became very abusive. And I'm not going to play a bunch of the footage. I will play a few clips really quick. But we're talking about things like slamming your kid into a bookshelf.
What the fuck? What did you do? What the fuck? I didn't do that. What the hell is that? I didn't do that. You tell me what you did. I swear to God, I didn't do that. Jody, roll over your carpet. I didn't do that. I swear. Cody. I didn't do it. You're taking it. The fucking lion again. You did everything. We didn't do this. Yes, you did. Stop. Yes, you did. It's just a prank, bruh. I hate him. No. No. Get out of my chair.
If we look past the screaming and cursing at the kids, there's also the physical element. Not just between some of the kids, which people would say, oh, you know, that's just families. In a video they called Tablet Destruction Prank, at one point the dad pushes Cody. That sends him face first into a bookshelf, and then we see later in the video his pillow is covered with blood. He has a bloody nose not only because his dad decided to make this video, but because he pushed him. Although the father's defense is that it wasn't actually blood, it was red ink.
Or setting your kids up by playing a game where they have to flip a bottle of water and make it land face up on a table, and if they don't do it right, another kid gets to slap them in the face in front of the camera. Hard.
And you know you don't hit girls. Yeah, but she's your sister, she don't count. Oh my God!
You ever clicked on a link and then immediately regretted it? Now imagine a YouTube channel where instead of pets being tortured, it's children. That's Daddy05, the child abuse comedy channel, and boy is it popular.
In one video, the little girl is screaming about how she wants to go home to her actual mother, which he edited out the words home. You can clearly tell he's cutting the audio.
You guys are making everything horrible for me! Emma! What the hell are you talking about?
She says everybody's making everything horrible for me. I want to go home. What the hell are you talking about? You should be grateful to get this abuse from us. It's my house.
Everyone's freaking brother! Stop at me!
Now we hear Cody saying, it's funny. She's crying. He says it's funny because he has learned that evil equals entertainment.
And he's laughing about how she's so upset her brain doesn't work anymore.
I got her so damn pissed off. Her brain ain't even working.
She got so damn pissed off. She ain't even working. Her brain ain't even working.
That's trauma. That's psychologically traumatizing small children for profit on YouTube who totally...
In the final analysis, the ruling psychopath class would like us to go way beyond tolerating torture, where we are now, and move to a state of embracing torture as a necessary part of society. They want you to endorse torture as a way of controlling extremist thoughts, which by definition are any ideas not issued by or sanctioned by the state. As a human, you should know that for everyone that is subject to torture, we lose a little bit of each of our individual humanity. For every program that is actively underway, torturing innocents on our behalf, our species drops into an increasing state of dehumanization. A dehumanization from which collectively we may never be able to return. Through torture, the psychopaths are devolving human consciousness to a point where we can no longer embrace the notions of love, caring, and compassion, and must sink into a state detached from feelings, ethics, morality, and right action, into a degenerated state of blind, machine-like existence. From this presentation, you now know what's going on around you, to your neighbors, and soon to you. You also must realize that there's no escape without resistance. There's no future for humanity without your involvement in pushing back against the psychopathic elites that wield the torture instrument designed to control, dehumanize, and devolve mankind into a state of being which constitutes the cruelest state of perpetual slavery. Please wake up and take action. While you watch this video, millions of people were being tortured by deep state agencies throughout the world. Have compassion. Help make these atrocities stop. Not just for their sake, but for your sake, and the sake of our children and grandchildren. Thank you.